Um, Obviously, I'm a little biased, really excited to talk about our latest digital tool that we've added to our platform here at GE called Airspace Insight. My name is Iain. I'm the product manager for Airspace Insight. Been with GE about 17 years now. Most of that as a technical pilot in our navigation division. And the last 3 or 4 years just starting to build out this digital tool. So again, really happy to have you guys here with us. So not a lot of people will know that GE even has a navigation division. Everybody, of course, knows us well and truly as the greatest engine maker in the world. But for the last 20 years, in fact, we were key in implementing a brand new kind of navigation infrastructure called Required Navigation Performance Authorization Required, or RNPAR. And so the founders of our business were a couple of pilots from Alaska Airlines. They needed to find a way to get their 737s into some incredibly mountainous terrain. And they came up with this new technology, like I said, called RNPAR. That work that they did in Alaska eventually went on to become the FAA's design criteria and then ICAO's design criteria. So again, this is the very heart of my business, is flight procedure design. If you look down to the bottom right there on your right-hand side, you'll see one of the very first approaches that we did into Queenstown in New Zealand for Qantas, Air New Zealand, Virgin Australia. I think it's about 5 airlines now flying that procedure. These procedures, all GPS-based, of course, but the nice thing about this technology is we can actually weave aircraft through terrain. So we don't have these massive trapezoidal safe surfaces like we do with something like an ILS. With these procedures, it's what we call linear containment. So again, think of a string winding its way through the lowest part of the terrain. About 3 weeks ago, departing Queenstown, Virgin Australia had a bird strike at 50 feet, lost an engine, and with our technology, the aircraft, as soon as it recognizes an N1 rollback, so it recognizes that that engine is about to fail or is in the process of failing, it automatically prompts the crew in their FMS with a brand new route, what we call an engine out SID. That engine out SID allows the aircraft to now weave its way over the lowest part of the terrain. So with one engine performance, as you're climbing, you're able to miss all of those obstacles. So like I said, about 3 weeks ago, we had our first instance of an actually in-service event of an aircraft flying our engine out SID. So that's kind of where the technology starts. We used to say any terrain challenged environment, RNPAR is what is perfect for you. But then we quickly discovered in places like Bangkok, here in Thailand, this is their secondary airport in Bangkok called Don Muan. And in Don Muan, it is surrounded by all of the king's palaces, these restricted areas in red. And so what was happening with all of the airlines here, you can kind of just see the downwind track that they're doing over top of this bigger restricted airspace and then having to dive down and into the airport. We took the same ideas of a terrain challenged airport using that, again, that very linear containment philosophy, and we now applied it to areas of complex airspace. So we moved from just using the criteria for terrain airports into complex airspace. And then finally, what we realized is with our procedure designs, even in airspaces that are in the middle of nowhere, we can use the procedures to get significant efficiency benefit. So we can now roll out a narrow body aircraft, a 37 and A320, on about a 3 nautical mile final in IMC conditions. So anywhere from about 15 to 20 miles of track mile savings. So you can imagine the fuel savings on every flight. This was a real significant turning point for us. So this is where we've worked. Had the good fortune to work all over the world deploying these procedures. Like I said, we did the world's first of those procedures up here in Juneau, Alaska. I'm actually based out of Canada. I used to be with an airline called WestJet. We deployed the procedures to about 20 of our airports in Canada. As you can imagine, there's a lot of mountainous terrain there. And then from there, we spent a lot of time working in New Zealand, Australia, Southeast Asia, and China, of course, as well, mostly in the Tibetan Plateau. So then this brings us to our passion for airspace efficiency. So we've now been working, like I said, for the last 20 years, understanding what these procedures can do from an efficiency standpoint. And we don't have to make the argument that it's either efficiency or safety. RMPAR provides a coded vertical flight path down to the runway or down to your decision altitude, and then provides you also with the advantage from a safety perspective of, again, the engine out procedures. So in addition to the safety, we now add efficiency to the equation. And of course, with efficiency, when we talk about fuel efficiency, we now bring sustainability into the argument, reducing carbon emissions, of course. And as we saw with the flexibility of the tracks, we can also place those tracks over non-noise sensitive areas. So this whole idea of sustainability really plays well into the kind of work that we're doing. So it's fantastic for GE to have numbers on the kind of savings that we could produce in airspace with this kind of technology. It's always better when you have somebody in industry tell that message to your customers for you. But this is what we have here. For those of you that aren't familiar, CANSO is essentially the industry organization for air navigation service providers around the world. You can think of it as their IATA. CANSO has essentially said that there's about 6 to 10% waste going on, operational waste taking place in the airspace today as a result of air traffic control. Eurocontrol, which is the umbrella organization for all of the ANSPs within Europe, they've estimated on any given city pair, there's anywhere from 8.5 to about 11% excess fuel burn because of air traffic control. So now even the industry organizations are saying, hey, we need to do something about that. These are big numbers. Airlines, of course, are, all they want to do is save fuel, right? We're doing things like single engine taxi, reduced flap landings, where we're taking potable water off of the aircraft. We're reducing about, the amount of food that we're carrying on board the aircraft. We're taking window shades out. So the idea for us was, how do we create a tool that allows airlines to work with air traffic control to start getting at some of these really big numbers that are costing us a lot of money. So out of that came this wonderful, again, no bias, wonderful product called Airspace Insight. Just a few quick screenshots there of the two main phases of the tool. The first one here is just a network view. So what we have done is we have taken worldwide surveillance data and we have plugged it into the tool, and we apply efficiency metrics to every airport and route within that system. So very simply, anything red on this map would indicate that that airport is less efficient than any other airport in green or yellow, for instance. And I'll talk about those efficiency metrics in a minute. And then the second screen is, once I've determined where there's a problem in my network and how much it's costing me, then I can actually drop the data into a tool with various other sources of disparate data like navigation data, weather data, population data, to understand how I can further mitigate that waste that's taking place. For those of you that are familiar with GE, we're very fond of the Six Sigma process improvement process. And so this is essentially what the tool is doing. It's allowing you to define where the problem is in your network. So again, as an airline, if you serve over 200 airports, within your network, how do you know where is the place that's causing you the most grief or the place that has the most inefficiency? And so that's what the tool was meant to do. We measure it with standardized metrics. So not only are we using airline metrics like excess fuel burn, excess track miles, excess time spent in a terminal, but we're also using things like workload metrics for air traffic control. How many radio transmissions are taking place between the aircraft and air traffic control? So we're looking at those kind of things as well. Like I said, that then allows us to analyze what's taking place in any given terminal environment. We bring in weather, population, like I said, surveillance data, and all of the navigation infrastructure data like 424 data, if anybody's familiar with that. The nice thing for air traffic control in the airline world, I think we're very used to working with each other at the operational level. When I worked for an airline called WestJet in Canada, we would work operationally very closely with Air Canada. There was none of this kind of commercial disparity between the two airlines. And so what we see with the ANSPs, though, is they work very much in silos, right? They're very concerned about their operation and what's going on in their airspace, but don't have the time to lift their head up and to see how are challenges being solved elsewhere in the world. Again, with worldwide surveillance data, they now have an opportunity to see, hey, this airport, this airspace is exactly like ours, similar type of equipment mix, a similar type of terrain, and this is how they've managed to solve the issues that we've been doing ourselves. And then finally, on the control side, once we've implemented these different techniques to improve the efficiency of any given airspace, then we can actually measure it and understand: are we getting better? Are we getting worse? What else is it that we need to do? So again, big fans of the Six Sigma process at GE. So I'll just walk you through how a customer goes about, first of all, finding a problem and then solving what the issue is. So like I said, when a customer first comes into the tool, they're greeted with this network page, which again is color coding all of their airports based on how efficient that airspace is. They could further filter to their own network. So we're going to look at a use case from Qantas here. So you'll see that Qantas then further says, hey, I just want to see all of the airports in my network and see where the problem children are. But I could also filter by aircraft type. I could just say, hey, show me everywhere that my 787s fly. And I want to understand, where there's efficiency to be gained there. So like I said, not only do we color code and analyze the individual airspace or terminal areas, but we do it for the routes as well. And in this case, and this was the real value add for airlines, was show me how I'm performing against my competitor. Show me every route where my competitor is doing better than I am. And so this was the first big find for Qantas, and it was their what they call Qantas One from Heathrow down to Singapore on an A380. This has been their flagship route for years. That one A380 then goes on from Singapore to Sydney and feeds their entire domestic network. So this is a crucial flight for them. So sure enough, when they brought it up in Airspace Insight, you can see right away that every other airline that's flying that route is performing it more efficiently than what they are. So then they go in, they download thousands of different trajectories during, I think, a 1-year period in this case, and then they parse out all of the data into the different operators that are operating on that one route. So you'll see here in white, Singapore Airlines is performing that flight, again, from Singapore to Heathrow in about 12.5 hours. You'll see worst case here, Qantas is almost taking an additional 30 minutes to fly that exact same flight. So I'm not sure what you know about revenue management at the airlines, but you go to Expedia and you say, hey, I want to go from Singapore to Heathrow, and right away it ranks it by the cost of the flight. But the secondary criteria is how historically you're blocking that flight. So if you're blocking that flight considerably longer than another airline, you then drop down to position number 2 in Expedia. So this causes all kinds of problems for the airline. Not only that, when they look at historical data to decide how to schedule that flight from a crewing and aircraft perspective, they're now being told that flight takes us almost 13 hours. And so there's waste that's taking place on the crew scheduling side, on the aircraft scheduling side. It's a revenue management problem. And first and foremost, operationally, there's just a ton of waste going on. So dropping it into a visual program like this, what were they able to see? First and foremost, Singapore Airlines does not have the same kind of restrictions that Qantas does and US carriers that are flying in that region do, which of course is overflying Iranian airspace over Tehran. So we can't really compare ourselves then to something that we're just not going to be able to do. But when we looked at what British Airways was doing on that route, they were blocking it in about 2:48. So still a significant savings, again, on an A380. And when we brought it up further in the tool, you can see that British Airways is taking advantage of flying through the southern part of the Jordanian airspace here. At some point in Qantas's history, there had been a regulation or a limitation on their operations that did not allow their airline to fly through Jordanian airspace. And that operational limitation had been left in their navigation database for years, and nobody had ever looked at it again until they started to compare their own operations against how every other airline was operating in that environment. So the airlines, man, we're really good at blaming air traffic control and our air navigation service providers on the delays that they causes and the inefficiency. But this was a perfect example of a self-induced problem of an old, stale route in a navigation database that had just been left alone. And it was wasting as much as almost $400,000 a year on an A380 additional fuel burn. So these are massive problems for the airline to try to solve. Just a few other case studies just before we wrap up. I'll just show some other examples of how other customers are using it. This was Virgin Australia operating into the Sunshine Coast, just kind of northern Queensland in Australia. Just looking at this, I'll just break it down for you. Anything in green here, these are all of the departure paths. All of these magenta lines are the arrivals that come to this I-tide star, and then onto this RMP procedure and into the southbound runway there. When we did when Virgin looked at this route and said, hey, how are we performing against all of the other traffic? They found that they in fact were 2 minutes slower on every flight than what Qantas was doing. And so of course now the question becomes, well, why is that? What is it that Qantas is doing that we should be doing? And so again, we can then further break down the data, and we can see examples of Qantas requesting and getting this direct from the IF point of the star to the initial approach fix of the approach itself, which is saving them about 2 minutes per flight. So if you say about 2.5 minutes savings, and you assume that you only ever get that direct approved about 20% of the time, that's about a $50,000 savings per year for Virgin Australia. And again, this is not an example of air traffic control doing anything wrong. This is something that the airline has complete control over themselves. So they issue a crew briefing to the inbound crews into the Sunshine Coast, and they say, hey, when you're inbound from the south, planning this arrival, make the request 10 miles out that you would like the direct from, again, the IF to the IAF of the approach. 8 out of 10 times, they're not going to be able to give it to you because of perhaps VFR aircraft within this area. But those 2 opportunities that we do get, that's significant savings for us as an airline, and it allows us to compete better with the other operators on this route. I feel like I'm picking on Qantas here, but they were readily agreeable to show you the kinds of things that they themselves had done to themselves. This was an example when they looked at their routings from Sydney up to Incheon in South Korea. They saw that they were about 19 minutes slower than Korean Airlines on the exact same route. And what they realized again was one of their routes in their database that was being picked by the flight planning system had been built originally to avoid an area of volcanic activity. So this Sakurajima volcano at one point had been spewing ash plume, and a NOTAM had gone out to restrict aircraft movements around that. Qantas, diligently so, had built another route that avoided that restricted area, but it was never removed from their database. So again, their flight planning system continues to say, hey, I have to pick this route today because all of the other ones have been told, don't pick because of this volcano. So over a period of about 28 flights before they actually caught this with the tool, that 19 minutes per flight addition cost Qantas about $42,000. And again, I just keep stressing, none of this has to do with air traffic control. Airspace waste, absolutely. But these are all problems that the airline were to address themselves with the capability of being able to look at how the other operators were flying in that environment. The other thing Qantas likes to do is refer to this as their spy tool. So they were starting up operations into JFK, and about 6 months before that, Air New Zealand had beat them to the punch. And so for 6 months, Qantas just sat and ingested all of the routings that Air New Zealand was getting, all of their oceanic clearances, so that when Qantas hit when the rubber hit the road for Qantas 6 months later, they knew exactly what kind of routing they would be getting and all of their oceanic clearances. So the amount of time that this reduced in after the fact, after a route has been deployed and you're trying to figure out, okay, what did we actually get versus what we thought we got, we now have that much more assurance. So these are just some examples then of use cases where airlines then now need to bring in their ANSP, air traffic control, and start to collaborate on where things could be improved in the airspace. Etihad had just completed, Etihad going into Abu Dhabi, which is their big hub. They had just finished their sustainability demonstration flight from Heathrow with a 787 Ecoliner, I think they refer to it as. And they said after the fact, they said, hey, how did we do from a navigation standpoint? Right, we did all of these things with the aircraft and with the crew policies. How did we do from a navigation standpoint? When we look at all of the trajectories coming in from Heathrow, anything in blue that you can see here, you can see that ATC is doing your typical ILS intercept type procedures there, right? So of course, from our background, as I talked about right off the beginning, being that we've deployed so much RMP AR infrastructure, we said, well, why would you not have done that? That is significant savings. And they said, oh, but we did. A couple of years ago, GANS, who is the ANSP in Abu Dhabi, had built out all of this infrastructure to each of the runways. So it was $1.5 million project to build out RMP AR procedures into Abu Dhabi. I don't know if you can see from there, but how many blue lines are actually following this red line here? Can anybody see? I'll give away the hint, it's a whopping 0. So the ANSP, by virtue of my air navigation service fees, has deployed $1.5 million solution that nobody's using. This magenta line here basically rolls the aircraft out to about a 4-mile final off of that downwind leg. These are procedures that we see here in Denver, in LA, in Houston, where I'm from, in Calgary, in Canada. This infrastructure is deployed today and used all the time. And so the case has been made, if we could deploy that into Abu Dhabi, the savings were absolutely outrageous. So almost 500 kilograms of fuel savings per approach. So again, in this age of everybody trying to cut down on carbon, the airlines are being told to do a lot of that themselves. Buy new engines, buy new airframes, use SAF. What we're trying to do with this tool is bring the ANSP into that conversation. How can you help me? How do we reduce fuel burn together? Another example that came from our friends at Qantas, when they switched from the transition from the F-18 to the F-35, all of the airspace just to the northwest of Sydney, it's kind of hard to tell here, but there's a bit of a dark maroon area. This was the original restricted training area for their F-18 squadron. When the F-35 came along, they realized that they needed a much bigger restricted area to play with. And so, fortunately, Air Services Australia, the ANSP in Australia, said, hey, this is the plan. We want to understand what the impact will be to you as an airline. And so again, using the tool, they were able to go through all of their routes that pass through that airspace and provide back to Air Services Australia, hey, this is what's going to happen to us if you put this new airspace into play. But now we can have a conversation. Now we can say, well, does that restricted airspace have to be open 24 hours a day? Does it have to always be up to max, flight level 600? And so this is what Qantas was able to do, was to measure the potential impact of that new restricted airspace, and then work with their ANSP to say, hey, how about during these hours we still have access to this route, or during these hours we bring down the ceiling of that restricted airspace. All right, last slide. And for any of you in the ATC world, this is awesome. Again, I'm biased. So I think, again, given our history with deploying this RMP type trajectories there, I think we've gotten pretty well at telling the story from an airline perspective, right? We've gotten really good about saying, hey, airline, if you fly our procedures, you're going to save X amount of fuel, X amount of time, you're going to improve your access into this airport X number of times. The thing that we were pretty poor at was communicating the benefit to air traffic control. And so how do we do that? And so what we came up with was a workload algorithm. So in addition to the surveillance data that we're pulling into the tool, we also pull in the airline's own aircraft flight data. So we can tell every time there's a radio transmission between the ground and the aircraft. We can tell every time a flap handle moves, a gear handle moves. Any of the thousands of parameters on that aircraft are dumped into this tool. And so what that allows me to do is to heat map out things like, hey, show me every time there's a heading bug change, or an altitude bug change, or a speed bug change, or the gear goes down, or the flaps go down, or again, there's a radio transmission between the ground and the aircraft. And so this was able to tell us, okay, if I look at these two procedures, we know the airline wants to fly this one, but why should air traffic control clear me on this procedure? And what we saw time and time again with RMP was that the workload for the controller was pushed much further out into the terminal environment than the typical ILS intercept, where that workflow continues, right up until 3, 4, 5 miles on final, because you're constantly giving me headings, altitudes, speeds, right, to get me onto that localizer. So that's how we started to solve this. And we had tremendous success. This was a case study we did in Penang in Malaysia. And right away after we met with them and started using this metric, the clearance rates on our procedures went up by about 23%. So that is the end of my presentation. So thanks for joining me, but glad to take any questions if there are any in the audience.
How many airlines have opted in to give you data for this, or is this something that you just are able to pull?
Yeah, so one of GE's other big plays, is our event management system. So I'm not sure if people are familiar with FOQA data. It's the data that comes off of the airline. So GE has customers all over the world that supply their data that we then basically filter through this event management system and spits it back to the airline. So I mean, there's literally hundreds around the world that supply that. So if you're Qantas using this tool, you would see the worldwide surveillance data because that's publicly available, but you would only see your own flight data, right? You'd never be able to see, Qantas would never be able to see Air New Zealand's data, for instance. Yeah, they're kept pretty sterile.
That was one of my questions as well. How do the airlines that are doing this more efficiently feel about you disclosing this information,
Yeah, no, you're bang on. And so that's why that has also been a challenge of flight data, right? Because the airlines know this data exists out there somewhere. And with the advent of the ADS-B data, they now have full visibility into, now look, I'm not going to be able to see how Air New Zealand is flying their 787 versus how I'm flying mine, right? I'm not going to be able to see the particulars of, when are they extending flaps and gear, how efficient are they flying these vertical profiles, but I'm still able to see their trajectories, right? To do that kind of stuff of, how are they flight planning their routes that's different from me, that would give us a lot more efficiency. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Terrific. Thanks so much, guys. Hope you enjoy the rest of Oshkosh.